The morning began as any other in the small market town of Hatherleigh, tucked deep in the English countryside. It was late October of 1878, and the air carried the sharp chill of autumn. A low fog drifted through the cobblestone streets, curling around iron lampposts and damp shop fronts, while the school bell rang out with a dull, metallic echo. Children, wrapped in woolen scarves and clutching worn satchels, hurried toward the schoolhouse, their shoes clattering against the stones slick with morning dew. Inside, the classroom smelled faintly of coal smoke and wet coats. The wooden benches creaked as children shuffled into their places, whispering and giggling before the day's lessons began. The tall windows let in only a thin gray light, filtered through the mist outside. Ink bottles and chalk dust gave the air a sharp tang, mingled with the faint sweetness of porridge some had eaten before arriving. At the front of the room stood Clara Hensleigh, the schoolteacher. 37 years old, with neatly pinned hair and a plain gray dress, she was a stern figure. She began the day's recitation with her usual precision, voice crisp, posture rigid. Her students, ranging in age from 7 to 12, knew better than to cross her. To the townsfolk, she was respected, if not beloved. A woman who had devoted her life to discipline and learning. But this morning something was different. As Clara paced between the rows of desks, her sharp eyes scanning slates and copybooks, a faint cough broke the rhythm. One boy, Thomas, pressed his hand to his stomach, his face pale. Another, little Mary Carter, followed, wincing as though a knife twisted inside her. Within minutes, more children slumped forward, their pencils falling from trembling fingers. Murmurs of confusion filled the room, rising into frightened cries. The smell of ink and chalk was soon overpowered by another, an acrid chemical bitterness that seemed to cling to the air. The children clutched at their bellies, their skin clammy, their lips trembling as they gasped for breath. The wooden floor echoed with the thud of small bodies collapsing one after another. Panic spread. Some children screamed and fled into the fog outside, shouting for their parents. Others stayed frozen, too frightened to move, watching as their classmates writhed in pain. And through it all, Clara Hensleigh stood at the front of the classroom. Her expression was unreadable. To some it looked like shock. To others, an unsettling calm, as though she had anticipated the chaos unraveling before her. By the time villagers rushed into the schoolhouse, the scene was one of horror. Several children lay groaning on the floorboards, their faces ashen. Mothers fell to their knees, lifting their sons and daughters into their arms, their cries echoing through the schoolroom walls. The local doctor was summoned, but even his hurried steps could not arrive quickly enough to save every child that morning. In the weeks that followed, the town would struggle to understand what had happened inside those walls. Was it spoiled food? A deadly illness sweeping through the countryside? Or something far more sinister hidden in plain sight? Clara Hensleigh, the quiet, disciplined teacher, remained a figure of fascination. Witnesses remembered her moving slowly. Between the benches, her hands folded tightly in front of her, her voice strangely steady amidst the screams. Others swore she seemed almost detached, as though she were observing rather than intervening. Whispers began to spread in hushed tones at market stalls and in church pews. Some said the children had been cursed. Others suspected bad milk or poisoned bread. But no one dared speak aloud the most terrifying possibility, that the trusted teacher, the woman who had taught their sons and daughters their very first letters, might be the one responsible. For now, the town was gripped by confusion, fear, and grief. Coffins far too small were lowered into the ground, their polished surfaces gleaming under the pale November sun. Parents clutched one another, bewildered at how so many young lives could be extinguished so suddenly. And Clara? She stood among them at the funerals, her hands clasped, her lips whispering prayers for the very children who had died under her care. To the grieving families, she appeared as a figure of solemn sympathy. Yet beneath that calm exterior, secrets lingered, secrets that, once uncovered, would shake the town to its very core. For what kind of darkness could hide behind the face of a schoolteacher? What would drive a woman entrusted with the hopes of parents and the futures of children to betray her class in the most horrifying way imaginable. The answer lay buried beneath layers of respectability, loneliness, and obsession. And soon the town of Hatherleigh would discover that evil does not always come as a stranger. In the night, it can just as easily be found at the front of a classroom. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in Hatherleigh, one must first step back into the world of late Victorian England. It was a time of contradictions, an age of progress and reform, but also of poverty, secrecy, and quiet desperation. The year was 1878. Gas lamps flickered in city streets, but in small towns like Hatherleigh, life still moved to the rhythm of church bells and market days. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp earth as families crowded into modest brick homes, their windows streaked with condensation from cooking fires. For the working class, life was a struggle. Men labored in fields or workshops, women took in laundry or sewing, and children, though now legally required to attend school, were often pulled into work as soon as they were old enough to contribute. Education, though, was changing. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 had made schooling mandatory for children between the ages of 5 and 13, a radical shift in the lives of families who had once relied on their children's wages. In Hatherleigh, as in many villages, the schoolhouse was more than just a building. It was a symbol of progress, discipline, and above all, trust. Parents entrusted their children to the teacher, believing she would prepare them for a better life than their own. The school itself was a squat, one-room structure with high windows and thick wooden beams. Inside, rows of benches faced a chalkboard, and an iron stove sat in the corner to ward off the winter chill. The smell of chalk dust clung to the air, mixing with coal smoke from the stove and the faint tang of ink from small glass bottles. It was here, in this ordinary place, that an extraordinary horror would unfold. At the center of it all stood Clara Hensleigh. Clara was born in 1851, the daughter of a village tailor and his wife. Unlike many girls of her time, she had been given the chance to study beyond basic literacy. Her father, proud of her intelligence, encouraged her love of books. She excelled at her studies, her handwriting precise, her memory sharp. But her intelligence, though admired, also set her apart. From her youth, Clara had been a solitary child. While other girls played in the fields or gossiped about courtships, she spent hours reading alone. Neighbors would later remember her as bookish, quiet, and serious. When her parents died within a few years of each other, Clara, unmarried and with no siblings, devoted herself entirely to teaching. By her mid-30s, she had become the headmistress of the Hatherleigh School. To the outside world, she was the picture of dedication. Her dress was always plain, her hair neatly pinned, her posture rigid. She carried herself with the composure of someone who demanded respect and order. Parents praised her discipline, believing it instilled proper values in their children. But to the students themselves, Clara was a figure to be feared. She had a sharp temper, a cold stare that could silence even the most mischievous child. Corporal punishment, common at the time, was delivered by her hand without hesitation. Yet beneath the surface of discipline and duty, something darker seemed to stir. Clara never married. Suitors, if they had ever called, were turned away or discouraged by her stern demeanor. The loneliness of her small, unchanging life pressed in on her like the heavy fog that settled over Hatherleigh's streets each winter. Some whispered that she envied the families around her, watching mothers walk their children to school, hearing laughter spill from the cottages in the evenings. Others believed she had grown bitter, resentful of the very children who filled her classroom with noise and energy. Her colleagues and neighbors noted her fascination with science, particularly medicine. She was known to visit the apothecary, often asking questions about compounds, remedies, and the effects of certain powders. To many it seemed harmless curiosity, but to a few it felt unsettling, an interest too deep, too intense for a village schoolteacher. Still, nothing about Clara's life suggested the horrors to come. She was, by all outward appearances, a woman of order and morality, someone trusted with the futures of the town's children. The schoolhouse thrived under her control, and though students feared her, parents respected her authority, And yet, as autumn descended on Hatherleigh in 1878, cracks in this carefully constructed image began to form. The children's laughter outside the schoolhouse walls, once a reminder of her role as guide and protector, began to gnaw at her. Each day she walked home alone, her footsteps echoing against the cobblestones, the silence of her small house pressing in on her like a weight. Perhaps it was envy. Perhaps it was bitterness. Perhaps it was something darker still, festering quietly in the corners of her mind. Whatever the cause, by the time the first child in her care fell mysteriously, ill Clara Hensleigh had already begun down a path from which there would be no return. The first signs of trouble appeared so quietly that no one thought to question them. It began with a cough here, a stomachache there. In late October of 1878, several children from the Hatherleigh school fell ill. Their parents assumed it was nothing more than a passing ailment, spoiled milk, or perhaps the damp autumn weather settling into their lungs. Children grew ill often in those times, and families were used to treating minor sickness at home with warm broths and poultices. No one imagined anything sinister, yet, inside her classroom, Clara Hensleigh was already conducting her private experiments. She had long studied powders and tinctures, making quiet notes in the margins of her books. Now, in the privacy of her small home, she began mixing small amounts of arsenic into liquids, testing what she had only read about in theory. Arsenic was readily available in Victorian England, sold at apothecaries as a rat poison used to treat pests, and even present in cosmetics and dyes. To the average villager, it was a household product. To Clara, it became something else entirely, a weapon invisible to the eye, tasteless when properly prepared, and devastating in its effect. Her classroom became her laboratory. At first, she added trace amounts into the morning porridge she served the children. The doses were small enough to cause discomfort, but not death. An aching belly, dizziness, fatigue. To her students and their parents, it seemed nothing more than a bout of seasonal sickness. Clara watched them carefully, noting which children reacted most strongly, how long it took for symptoms to appear, how long they lingered. She even recorded her observations in a private journal, hidden away in her desk, using phrases that seemed like ordinary lesson notes but carried darker meanings. The sickness passed and life resumed. Parents sent their children back to school, never questioning that their teacher might be at the root of the problem. But Clara was not finished. By November, her experiments grew bolder. This time she laced the tea provided during lessons. The children sipped unsuspectingly, their young faces lighting with laughter as they chattered with friends, unaware of the bitter grains dissolving in their cups. Hours later, the classroom once again filled with the sounds of distress, groans, whimpers, the scraping of benches as children doubled over in pain. This time, the sickness was more severe. One boy, James Whitcomb, only 8 years old, collapsed before reaching home. His mother described him as sickly and pale, gasping like he could not catch his breath. Within 2 days, James was dead. The town doctor, puzzled, suggested it might have been contaminated bread. Bread was a common culprit in sudden illness, as flour could easily spoil. No one looked at Clara, who stood solemnly by the boy's coffin, her lips pursed in prayer. But death did not still her hand. The more she poisoned, the more Clara seemed compelled to continue. Each incident gave her a sense of control, a secret knowledge that she alone commanded life and death in that tiny schoolroom. Neighbors recalled seeing her at the apothecary more frequently, asking in polite tones about remedies for rats or powders to keep the storeroom clean. To the apothecary, she was simply a cautious teacher keeping her supplies in order. Then came the largest incident, one that could no longer be explained away as mere bad luck. On a gray December morning, snow dusted the rooftops of Hatherleigh, and the classroom stove burned hot to fight the chill. Clara prepared tea once more, her movements methodical, her face expressionless as she stirred the cups. The children drank eagerly, grateful for the warmth in their hands. But by mid-morning, the room was filled with chaos. One after another, students collapsed, clutching at their stomachs. Their cries mingled into a chorus of agony. The floorboards shook as small bodies writhed upon them. Several vomited, their faces pale as wax. 2 children, Mary Carter and Samuel Griggs, would not recover. Both were buried before Christmas, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses that stood stark against the frozen earth. The village was plunged into mourning. Parents whispered about a curse, about some foul pestilence stalking their children. The doctor, desperate for answers, tested the water supply, examined the bread, even scolded families for poor hygiene. None considered the possibility that the woman leading prayers at the funerals, the very woman entrusted with their children, was secretly the hand behind the tragedy. Clara's role remained hidden. She even comforted grieving mothers, offering words of sympathy, her voice calm, her expression steady. If she felt guilt, she did not show it. If she doubted her actions, she left no trace. Instead, she recorded yet more notes in her journal, refining her understanding of dosages, observing patterns in suffering, perfecting her deadly craft. By the time winter settled fully upon Hatherleigh, the schoolhouse had become a place of dread. Children whispered of shadows, of sickness that seemed to strike only within its walls. Parents hesitated at the door each morning, reluctant to part, with their sons and daughters yet bound by law and duty to send them inside. Still, no one dared point a finger at Clara Hensleigh. Her mask of discipline and devotion remained intact. She was, to all outward appearances, a teacher fulfilling her role in a time of reform and progress. But beneath the surface, she had transformed into something far more dangerous, an experimenter whose classroom was no longer a place of learning, but a theater of death. And with each funeral procession that wound its way through the cobblestone streets, the question that no one yet dared to ask grew heavier. How many more children would be lost before the truth was revealed? At first, the deaths were treated as accidents. Tragic, inexplicable, but not criminal. In late 19th century England, sudden illness among children was heartbreakingly common. Cholera, diphtheria, scarlet fever. These diseases haunted every village, claiming young lives without warning. And so, when pupils from the Hatherleigh school began to fall ill, the town's doctor searched for answers in the usual places. He inspected the wells for contamination, questioned bakers about their flour, and examined the milk brought in from nearby farms. But nothing explained the pattern. The water was clean, the bread fresh, the milk unspoiled, and still, more children grew sick. By January of 1879, grief had hardened into unease. Parents whispered nervously in church pews and market stalls. Some muttered about a curse upon the schoolhouse. Others began to question why the illness seemed to strike only after hours spent within its walls. "They leave my house strong," one mother told the doctor, "and they return pale as death." The doctor himself began to sense something unnatural. The symptoms were too consistent: cramping stomachs, vomiting, seizures, sudden collapse. They pointed not to disease, but to poison. And then came the first cracks in Clara Hensleigh's careful mask. A boy of 9, still weak from one of the yow. Earlier attacks whispered to his mother that Miss Hensleigh gave us the medicine. The words might have been dismissed as fevered confusion, except other children echoed him. They recalled Clara pouring tea with unusual care, watching intently as they drank. One girl remembered how she forbade them from bringing lunches from home, insisting they eat only what was served in the schoolroom. These small details began to gnaw at the parents' trust. Clara's calm presence, once a comfort, now seemed too controlled. Her hands folded too neatly, her voice too steady when speaking at funerals. Some wondered aloud why she never fell ill herself. Still, suspicion was not enough. Evidence was needed. And in the late 19th century, evidence meant science, new, imperfect, but advancing. The town's doctor, desperate for answers, contacted a county chemist. Samples of food from the schoolhouse were collected: tea leaves, flour, and sugar. More disturbingly, the stomach contents of one of the children were examined. The chemist worked with early toxicology techniques, testing for substances known to cause sudden death. And there it was. Arsenic. Clear, undeniable traces of arsenic. The revelation struck like a hammer. Arsenic was no accident. It was no epidemic. Someone had placed it deliberately into the children's food and drink. Attention turned inevitably to the one person who oversaw every meal, who poured every cup. The evidence circled back to Clara Hensleigh. Authorities searched her home. Inside, they found papers filled with notes, cryptic entries about dosages and reactions. A jar of white powder purchased from the apothecary under the pretense of rat control sat in her cupboard. When tested, it too was arsenic. Clara was brought in for questioning. Witnesses later recalled how composed she appeared, her back straight, her expression calm. She denied any wrongdoing, insisting she had only ever cared for her pupils. She claimed the powder was for pests, the notes part of her lesson planning. But investigators, already armed with the chemist's findings, pressed harder. Her explanations grew thinner, her composure brittle. By March, Clara was formally arrested. The schoolhouse fell silent. Its doors closed indefinitely. Parents wept openly in the streets, clutching the hands of their surviving children, unable to comprehend how the woman they had trusted most had become the source of their deepest grief. The betrayal cut deeper than any ordinary crime. It was not a stranger who had brought death to Hatherleigh. It was the teacher, educated, respected, a figure of order and discipline. The very person who had led prayers over the tiny coffins was now accused of filling them. When the news spread beyond the village, newspapers seized on the story. Headlines dubbed Clara the schoolhouse poisoner and a Judas in the classroom. Reporters traveled from nearby towns to write of the scandal, painting her as both a monster and a mystery. Why would a teacher, a woman of learning and restraint, turn her classroom into a place of death? That question lingered unanswered as Clara sat behind the iron bars of the county jail. To some, she remained inscrutable, refusing to break her silence. To others, her very calmness was the most damning evidence of all. The town waited, breath held for the trial to come, hoping for answers, for justice, and perhaps for an explanation that would make sense of the senseless. But the truth, if it existed, remained locked inside Clara Hensleigh, as cold and unreachable as the stone walls that now enclosed her. The trial of Clara Hensleigh began in the spring of 1879 at the county court, held within a grand stone building whose tall windows cast long shadows across the polished oak floors. Word of the case had already spread far beyond Hatherleigh, drawing reporters, curious onlookers, and grieving families into the crowded gallery. From the moment Clara was led into the courtroom, chains faintly rattling at her wrists, she was the object of relentless attention. Dressed in a plain black gown, her hair neatly pinned, Clara appeared as calm as ever. She did not flinch beneath the eyes of the crowd. To many, her composure was chilling, proof, perhaps, of her coldness. To others, it was the demeanor of a woman resigned to her fate. They deal. Prosecution wasted no time in laying out the evidence. They presented the chemist's findings. Arsenic detected in the children's bodies, arsenic found in Clara's cupboard, arsenic discovered in the very tea leaves served in her classroom. They read aloud passages from her journal, cryptic notes that spoke of measurements and control, words that to the jury sounded less like lesson planning and more like the record of experiments. Witnesses took the stand. Parents described their children's sudden illnesses, their last moments of life. A surviving boy, pale and trembling, recounted how Miss Hensleigh had insisted they drink the tea, how she watched silently as his friends grew sick. His words drew gasps from the gallery, and more than one mother sobbed openly. The defense attempted to portray Clara as a woman of fragile mind, suggesting that loneliness and stress had broken her reason. They argued she might have handled poisons unwittingly, or confused them with harmless powders. But the weight of evidence was too heavy, the testimony too damning. Day after day, the trial unfolded like a grim theater. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding newspapers with lurid headlines. Schoolhouse poisonings, teacher stands accused, arsenic angel or calculating monster. Inside, Clara remained largely silent, her face unreadable. She neither confessed nor denied, offering little beyond quiet statements of innocence. After 2 weeks, the jury retired. Their deliberation was brief. Clara Hensleigh was found guilty of murder. When the judge passed sentence, his voice echoed through the hushed courtroom. You, Clara Hensleigh, stand condemned for the most unnatural of crimes. A Judas among women, you betrayed the very children entrusted to your care. You shall be taken from this place and hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy on your soul. A murmur spread through the room. Some relief, some horror. The families of the victims wept, clinging to one another. For them, the verdict was justice, though it could never restore what they had lost. Clara showed no visible reaction. She bowed her head slightly, then raised it again, her eyes calm, her face as pale and composed as it had been in the schoolhouse on that fateful morning. On the morning of her execution in July 1879, Clara was led to the gallows of the county prison. Outside, a crowd gathered, as they often did in that era, drawn morbidly to witness justice carried out. The air was warm, the sky cloudless, and the murmur of voices fell silent as she stepped forward. She did not resist. She spoke no final words. With quiet dignity or chilling detachment, she met her end, the rope snapping taut in a moment that ended months of fear and speculation. But Clara's death did not bring peace to Hatherleigh. The schoolhouse remained closed for years, its windows boarded, its benches collecting dust. Parents hesitated to entrust their children to any teacher, their faith in authority deeply shaken. The very symbol of progress, the education system, had been twisted into a place of betrayal. For a generation, Hatherleigh carried the scars of the schoolhouse poisonings. Newspapers debated Clara's legacy. Some painted her as a monster, proof of evil lurking even in the most trusted roles. Others cast her as a tragic figure, a lonely, embittered woman whose isolation had curdled into cruelty. Medical journals speculated about her mind, using her case as an example of female madness in an age still struggling to understand psychology. But in the homes of Hatherleigh, the legacy was simpler and far more painful. Empty chairs at dinner tables, toys left untouched, mothers and fathers haunted by the sound of coughing, by the memory of children returning home pale and sick. No explanation, no execution, could ever fill those silences. Clara Hensleigh faded into history, her name etched into records as the schoolhouse poisoner. Yet the questions remained. Why had she done it? Envy? Madness? A hunger for control? She had taken that answer with her to the grave. And so the story endures not with resolution, but with unease. For the true horror of Hatherleigh lies not only in the deaths of its children, but in the betrayal itself, the reminder that evil does not always wear a stranger's face. Sometimes it stands at the front of the classroom, smiling faintly, chalk in hand. Perhaps that was Clara's most enduring poison, not the arsenic hidden in teacups, but the doubt she left behind, the knowledge that trust, once broken, can never fully be restored.